The Viking Age began in the late 8th century, when Scandinavian seafarers started reaching beyond their home coasts with a new scale of travel, trade, raiding, and settlement. It is remembered for attacks on monasteries and towns, but that was only part of the story. The same ships that carried raiders also carried merchants, migrants, and political ambitions, linking the North Atlantic, the British Isles, the Frankish world, and routes far east into the river systems of Eastern Europe. To understand the period, we have to start with the conditions that made this expansion possible. By the late 700s, Northern Europe was changing. Local rulers were consolidating power, wealth was becoming easier to move, and long-distance exchange was expanding. At the same time, Scandinavian shipbuilding and seafaring skills gave small groups the ability to travel quickly and return home again, or to stay and settle. From those beginnings, a loose age of movement took shape, and its effects would reach far beyond Scandinavia itself. Scandinavia before the Viking Age was not a blank northern edge of Europe. It was a landscape of working farms, coastal settlements, fjords, forests, lakes, and trade routes, inhabited by people who had been adapting to those conditions for generations. The regions that later became Norway, Denmark, and Sweden already had established communities. They were local societies, but they were not cut off. Families depended on neighbors, kinship, seasonal exchange, and leaders who could protect property and help settle disputes. Most power in this world was personal and limited. At the beginning of the Viking Age, there were no large centralized states controlling all of Scandinavia. Authority rested with chieftains, local elites, and powerful households. Their influence came from land, weapons, gifts, reputation, and the ability to gather followers. Farmers needed leaders who could defend interests and negotiate with rivals. Leaders needed farmers who could provide support, labor, and loyalty. That balance created a society made up of many small power centers, linked by marriage, obligation, and exchange, but still fiercely local. The farmer's household formed the base of that system. Most people lived on small holdings and worked within a climate that demanded careful planning. The growing season was short. Livestock had to be fed through winter, hay had to be stored, grain had to be planted and harvested at the right time. In many places, survival depended on discipline and timing as much as on land itself. Coastal communities also used the sea as part of daily life. They fished, traveled, and traded by boat. Inland routes through lakes and rivers connected settlements that would otherwise have remained difficult to reach. Long-distance sailing would later become famous in the Viking Age, but the habits that made it possible were already in place. That matters because the later Viking expansion did not come from nowhere. The people involved inherited a long tradition of building boats, reading coastlines, and managing travel across difficult waters. Norse vessels had to be light enough to land on beaches, sturdy enough for open water, and practical for cargo, crew, and movement along rivers and shores. The surviving archaeological record is incomplete, and ship forms changed over time and from region to region, but the overall pattern is clear. Shipbuilding in Scandinavia was advanced because it had to be. Boats were used for fishing, transport, communication, trade, and later war. The social structure of these communities also shaped what came afterward. Land was often inherited within families, and status depended on maintaining ties across generations. A household was not only an economic unit, it was also the center of labor, memory, and obligation. Men and women both contributed to its survival, though their roles differed by place and rank. In elite households, women could hold important domestic authority, especially in the management of property and dependence. Even so, rank and custom still shaped the balance of power. There was no single legal system imposing order from above. Instead, communities relied on expectations that were known, negotiated, and sometimes disputed. The regions we now call Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were not yet fixed nation-states. Their boundaries were fluid, and their internal divisions were often more important than any later map suggests. Norway's mountains and broken coastline encouraged many small centers of power separated by difficult travel. Denmark, positioned near the entrances to the Baltic and the North Sea, was better placed for exchange and political competition. Sweden faced several directions at once, with access to the Baltic and, through river systems, routes farther east. None of these areas was uniform. Local geography shaped local politics, and those differences later influenced where Scandinavian groups traveled and how they operated abroad. Archaeology gives some of the clearest evidence for this earlier world. Burial sites, farm remains, weapons, tools, jewelry, and place names all point to settled communities with hierarchy and craft specialization. Not every grave belonged to a warrior, and not every rich burial means a kingdom in the later sense. But the material record does show people who valued rank, display, and connection. Goods moved between regions. Foreign objects reached Scandinavia through trade, long before the famous raids began. Contact with the wider world was already established. The Viking Age intensified those patterns and pushed them into new settings. Religion is harder to describe with the same certainty, because much of what survives was written down after Scandinavia had become Christian. That means later sagas and poems must be handled carefully. They preserve memories of older beliefs, but they do not give a simple, unchanged picture of the 8th century. Even so, pre-Christian ritual clearly mattered. Sacred places, household practices, and local ceremonies were part of social life. Religion was tied to community and status rather than to a centralized church. Leaders could use ritual to reinforce authority, and ordinary people likely looked for protection in a world shaped by uncertainty, weather, and violence. Taken together, these older patterns explain why the Viking Age developed as it did. Scandinavian society was rooted in place, inheritance, and local obligation. It was also maritime, mobile, and accustomed to competition. People knew how to move along coasts, how to build and use ships, and how to operate beyond the immediate farm or village when opportunity appeared. The Viking Age was not a sudden break with the past. It emerged from communities that were already organized, already connected, and already capable of traveling farther than their home districts. The Viking Age depends on ships first. Before raids, trade routes, and settlement, there had to be vessels that could actually cross the seas and rivers of northern Europe. Scandinavian shipbuilding gave people that reach. It turned timber, iron, rope, and sailcloth into a practical system of movement. Scandinavia's forests supplied much of the raw material. Builders selected wood with care, especially oak where it was available, though other woods also had their place. A ship was not made from a single solid frame. Planks were shaped, overlapped, and fastened so the hull could bend with the water instead of breaking against it. Iron nails and rivets held the structure together. Seams were sealed with caulking. The result was labor-intensive and deliberate. A reliable ship reflected planning, skill, and experience over time. That craftsmanship mattered because the waters around Scandinavia were demanding. The North Atlantic, the North Sea, and the long coasts of the region rewarded light, narrow, shallow draft ships that could be handled in changing conditions. These vessels could be rowed when needed, but they also carried sails, and the sail changed what was possible. It extended range, saved labor, and made longer travel more efficient when the wind was favorable. With both sail and oar, a crew could move along coasts, enter rivers, and land where heavier ships would struggle. That flexibility helped shape the wider pattern of Viking Age movement. A Scandinavian crew was not limited to one route or one purpose. It could follow shorelines from harbor to harbor. It could cross open water when weather allowed. It could travel inland along major rivers, treating waterways as roads into the interior. In every case, the ship was more than a means of attack. It was the tool that connected communities separated by water and distance. Scandinavians had been maritime people long before the Viking Age, so the change was not a sudden discovery of the sea. The change was scale. Better ships, more accumulated knowledge, and the pressures of competition at home made longer travel more practical. A voyage that had once been unusual could become routine. A crew that could go farther could also choose among more destinations. That widened the possibilities for trade, migration, and violence alike. It also changed how the landscape of northern Europe worked. The coastline no longer looked like a barrier alone. It became a kind of route system. Islands, inlets, firths, river mouths, and sheltered bays favored people who knew local waters and could read weather and shoreline. A ship that could come close to land had an advantage in a world without permanent harbors everywhere. It could bring goods to small communities. It could reach monasteries, markets, and defended settlements. It could also leave before a response was organized. The materials behind all this mobility came from an entire economy, not from shipbuilding alone. Timber had to be chosen and prepared. Iron had to be smelted and shaped. Sails required woven cloth, which meant sheep, spinning, and textile work. Rope and cordage had to be made as well. Farming households, craft specialists, and local leaders all contributed to the system that made seaborne travel possible. The ship was impressive, but it depended on ordinary production. Archaeology shows this better than later legend does. Surviving ship burials and excavated remains make clear that northern shipbuilding was highly developed by the early Viking Age. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships from Norway come from later than the first raids, but they show the technical tradition already in place. They were built for speed, stability, and practical use, and they could carry people and cargo over substantial distances. Written sources from the period are limited, and later sagas often add dramatic detail, so the physical evidence carries special weight here. Ship technology also shaped status and social organization. A vessel could carry traders one season and raiders the next. It could transport settlers, livestock, tools, and household goods. It could support local chiefs who wanted to gather wealth and followers. Control of a ship also signaled resources and influence. In that sense, the ship was not only an instrument of expansion, it was a sign that Scandinavian societies had developed the organization needed to turn distance into advantage. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia had more than maritime habit. It had the means to move effectively. Timber could become hulls, iron could hold them together, sails could extend range. Shallow draft ships could enter waters and rivers that heavier vessels could not manage. Once those tools were in place, the next step was easy to imagine. People already used to local competition and seaborne travel now had the practical equipment to act farther from home and to do it faster than many of the communities they met were prepared for. The early Christian West was the world the Vikings entered first. It was not a single kingdom or a single frontier, but a patchwork of Christian realms, monasteries, market towns, coastal estates and river routes stretching from Britain and Ireland to Francia and beyond. Scandinavia was not sailing into empty water. It was reaching into a connected world where wealth already moved by ship, by river, and by road. By the late 8th century, the western half of Europe still carried the long after effects of Rome's collapse. The old imperial system had broken apart centuries earlier, and no one power controlled the sea lanes that linked the North Sea, the Atlantic coast, and the Irish Sea. Instead, authority was divided among smaller kings, bishops, abbots, and local landowners. Some regions were relatively secure, but many coastal areas and river mouths were only lightly protected. That mattered because the same waterways used by merchants and messengers could also be used by raiders. A ship could arrive quickly, strike a target, and be gone before help gathered. Monasteries were among the most exposed places in this landscape. They were religious centers, but also centers of learning, landholding, and storage. They kept books, metalwork, livestock, and other portable valuables. Many were founded in isolated places because solitude was part of the religious ideal, and that isolation made them easier to reach by sea. Contemporary writers in England and on the continent understood this clearly. Their accounts preserve fear, grief, and surprise, although they interpret events through their own religious outlook. Those sources are important, but they are not neutral. They tell us how attacks were understood at the time, even when they do not explain every cause or motive. The same world was also tied together by trade. Silver moved across long distances, along with cloth, salt, wine, weapons, and luxury goods. The Baltic, the North Sea, and the river corridors of Western and Eastern Europe connected communities that spoke different languages and followed different customs. Scandinavian traders could move into those circuits as intermediaries, bringing furs, amber, and other northern goods outward and returning with silver, glass, and manufactured objects. Trade and raiding were not identical, but they were close together in practice. The same ships, routes, and seasonal knowledge could support either one, depending on opportunity and risk. That overlap helps explain why the Viking Age cannot be reduced to a single wave of violence. Raiding made Scandinavians notorious, but movement itself was the larger change. A landing on a coast could seize wealth, but it could also reveal harbors, defenses, markets, and local rivalries. Each voyage taught more about where goods were kept, where resistance was weak, and where new settlements might be possible. Over time, Scandinavian groups were not simply attacking at random. They were learning how the Christian West worked and where it was vulnerable. The British Isles and the Frankish lands were especially exposed because rich churches, trading ports, and scattered estates existed side by side. Some places were tied closely to larger kingdoms, others were far enough from the center that warnings traveled slowly. In practical terms, that meant the same sea could carry merchants and attackers, and the people who first saw the sails could not always know which they were seeing. By the late 8th century, the North Sea frontier had become a zone of repeated contact. It was still fragmented, but it was no longer distant. It was a place where Scandinavian power could begin to reach outward, and where the Western Christian world would soon learn how open its coasts really were. The raid on Lindisfarne took place in 793, when Scandinavian raiders struck the monastery on the tidal island off the coast of Northumbria. It was not the first violent landing from across the North Sea, but it became one of the most famous because English writers recorded it in a way that fixed it in memory. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later Northumbrian sources preserve the basic event, even if the details are uneven, and later writers added moral interpretation. A religious community was hit quickly and unexpectedly, valuables were taken, and the attack seemed to mark a change in the world those writers knew. Lindisfarne mattered because monasteries were more than places of prayer. They held books, metalwork, gift wealth, food stores, and the influence that came with royal patronage and landholding. They were part of the structure of Christian society. When raiders reached Lindisfarne, they were not only taking portable wealth, they were striking an institution that helped anchor religious and political life in Northumbria. That is one reason the raid stayed so vivid in memory. It was not the largest attack of the period, and it was not the first contact between Scandinavians and the western coasts. But it was close to the concerns of the writers who preserved it, and it could be understood as a direct assault on something sacred and important. The response to Lindisfarne shows that people in England did not suddenly discover danger from the sea in 793. Coastal insecurity was already familiar. The British Isles had long seen movement, trade, and conflict across the water. What changed in the late 8th century was the scale and frequency of those raids. Lindisfarne showed that attackers could cross open water, strike a known religious center, and withdraw before a local force could gather. That combination of speed and unpredictability would become one of the defining features of the Viking Age. The surviving sources also show how medieval writers made sense of such violence. Letters and chronicles from the period often treated raids as warnings or judgments, because they understood disaster through religious language. But behind that language was a practical problem. Britain's shorelines were long, uneven, and difficult to defend everywhere at once. Kings could strengthen certain places, but they could not guard every monastery, estuary, or landing place. Many monasteries stood in exposed locations because those sites were useful for worship, travel, and managing land. The same qualities that made them influential also made them vulnerable. Lindisfarne should not be taken as proof that Viking raiding suddenly began out of nowhere. The ships, seafaring skill, and knowledge of coastal routes that made such an attack possible had been developing for generations. It also does not mean that all Scandinavians were raiders. Men from the north could appear as merchants, scouts, settlers, or warriors, and sometimes more than one of those roles could belong to the same person at different times. What Lindisfarne shows is that some of those voyages had become capable of producing shock far beyond the immediate coastline. In the decades after 793, written sources record more raids along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish world. Some were small and seasonal. Others went farther inland by following rivers. They did not happen in a stable or peaceful landscape. Wealth was often concentrated in churches, royal estates, and trading settlements, while warnings moved slowly and local defense was uneven. That made repeated landings profitable, even when they were not held permanently. So Lindisfarne matters as a beginning in memory more than as a beginning in history. It was one striking moment in a longer process of Scandinavian mobility, expansion, and adaptation. The attack told the Christian West that the sea was not only a boundary, it was also a route by which danger, trade, and migration could arrive. After that, observers across Christendom had more reason to watch the horizon, because the people crossing it were becoming harder to classify and harder to stop. Viking raiding became feared along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia, because it followed a practical and repeatable pattern. The attacks were not random bursts of violence. They were shaped by sailing seasons, by weather, and by the simple advantage of speed. A crew could leave Scandinavia in the warmer months, strike a weak target, and return before winter set in. That made raiding effective without requiring permanent conquest. A shoreline village, a monastery, or a river settlement could lose portable wealth in a single visit and then spend months recovering from the shock. The places most often attacked were chosen because they were rich and lightly defended. Churches and monasteries held metalwork, books, food stores, land, and sometimes money or tribute. They were also often built in places that were easy to reach by water and difficult to defend quickly. In the British Isles and along the Frankish coasts, many religious houses stood near rivers, estuaries, or open shorelines. That location helped them function as centers of worship and landholding, but it also made them accessible to ships. Written sources from the period, especially those produced by monks and clerics, repeatedly stress this vulnerability. Those accounts are not neutral, but they do show how alarming these raids appeared to the people who experienced them. By the late 8th and early 9th centuries, coastal communities were learning that the threat could come in more than one form. Some Scandinavian groups came only to raid, others combined plunder with trade. In some cases, the same people may have shifted between these aims from one voyage to the next. That flexibility made the danger hard to answer. From a distance, ships could not always be identified as merchants, envoys, settlers, or raiders until it was too late. Even where local defenses existed, they were often fragmented. A monastery might depend on nearby secular lords for protection, while a village might have only a watch system and very little time to react. The Frankish world shows this pattern clearly. Along the coasts and river networks of the Carolingian realm, raiders could move in from the sea, then use rivers like roads leading inland. Major waterways such as the Seine and the Loire opened access to markets, towns, and wealthy estates far from the coast. In some cases, Scandinavian groups even wintered in captured or improvised bases, which made them harder to remove and allowed them to raid again the following season. Frankish sources record repeated alarm, the payment of tribute, hurried attempts to fortify vulnerable places, and efforts to block waterways. That response shows how quickly raiding became a matter of government, logistics, and military planning, rather than a single local disaster. Ireland followed a related path, though in its own setting. Monastic centres there were often wealthy and connected, and the coastal and island geography made seaborne movement relatively easy. Early raids on the Irish coast and on island monasteries were followed by more regular campaigning. Later, Scandinavian groups established long forts, fortified bases that gave them a more secure foothold. The evidence from annals and later narrative sources suggests a gradual shift from episodic attacks toward more organized activity. Once a base existed, raiders could return with better knowledge of the landscape and less immediate risk. That did not mean full settlement everywhere, but it did change the balance of power. Communities that had once thought of raiding as seasonal now had to deal with a more lasting pressure. Britain experienced the same tightening of expectations. After the attack on Lindisfarne, further raids affected Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and parts of Wales and southern England. Some targets were monasteries, others were towns, estates, or royal centres. The details varied, but the wider pattern was consistent. What had once seemed like a distant rumour became part of the yearly calculations of rulers, abbots, and local landholders. People repaired walls, concentrated valuables, and tried to improve warning systems. They also looked more seriously to nearby military support. Not every response worked well, but repeated raids forced defence into ordinary political life. The fear caused by these attacks was not only material, it also changed how people understood safety. A monastery or coastal town did not just lose goods, it lost confidence in the idea that distance from political power would offer protection. For Christian writers in the 9th century, the raids could appear as signs of disorder, punishment, or divine anger. Those interpretations reflect the worldview of the sources and should not be confused with modern explanation. Still, they help show why the raids left such a deep mark. They broke assumptions about where danger could come from. Places that had seemed marginal suddenly felt exposed, and places that had seemed secure discovered how quickly the sea could bring violence. Over time, that produced a repeated and familiar cycle. Ships arrived, goods were taken, captives were sometimes carried off. Local leaders responded after the fact. Defenses improved in some places and remained weak in others. Then the process began again. This cycle made Scandinavian activity around Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish coasts feel less like an isolated shock and more like a continuing fact of life. The danger did not become harmless, but it did become expected. That change mattered, because once communities began planning for raids as a recurring possibility, they also began building stronger defenses, gathering resources more carefully, and searching for broader political answers. Raiding was only one part of the story. The same ships that could appear suddenly on a coast also carried wool, hides, iron, amber, and other goods into markets where they were exchanged for silver, cloth, wine, weapons, and objects that had traveled much farther than most people ever would. The record shows this in several ways. Hoards of hacked silver coins and cut bullion show how often payment was made in weighed metal rather than formal coinage. Burial finds and trading sites reveal imported goods from many regions. Written sources outside Scandinavia, while usually focused on danger, also mention merchants and routes. Taken together, they show that Viking activity was not only violence, it was also movement, bargaining, and practical exchange. The clearest evidence for this mixed economy comes from the places where people gathered to trade, along the Baltic coast in the North Sea, and on river routes leading inland. Smaller settlements and seasonal markets linked Scandinavian communities to wider networks. Some became important enough to leave substantial archaeological traces. At Ribe in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and later Hedeby on the Danish frontier, excavations have uncovered craft production, weights, balance scales, tools, and foreign goods. These were organized places where merchants, travelers, and local rulers could all profit. A chief who controlled a harbor or market could tax trade, protect it, or use it to strengthen his own position. Commerce and political power often developed together. The same routes that carried valuables west and south also carried them east. Scandinavian traders moved across the Baltic and into river systems that connected the north to inland Europe and, eventually, to the Black and Caspian Seas. In these networks, furs from the north were highly valued. Amber, another northern product, had long traveled far beyond the Baltic world. Iron from Scandinavia was useful, while imported silver became one of the clearest signs of long-distance exchange. The large quantities of Arabic silver coins found in Scandinavia and along eastern routes are especially important. They do not mean that Vikings were simply raiding the Islamic world directly and constantly. They show that silver entered northern Europe through many intermediaries, moving through trade, tribute, gift exchange, and sometimes plunder before being cut up, weighed, and reused. In practice, silver mattered because it was portable, divisible, and widely accepted. This economy also had a darker side that was inseparable from its wealth. Captives were taken in raids and sold through commercial networks. Slavery and unfree labor were part of Viking Age society both in Scandinavia and abroad, and the sources show that people could be moved long distances as property. That helps explain why some expeditions were not just destructive, but also economically organized. A raid could produce metal, textiles, and livestock, but it could also produce people who could be sold, ransomed, or put to work. The line between war and commerce was often thin. A party that arrived as raiders might later appear as traders in a different place, or the same men might do both in the same season. To later observers, especially church writers, this mixture could seem morally disordered. Historically, it reflects a world in which wealth was gathered by whatever means could be made to work. Season also mattered. Seafaring in the North Atlantic and around the North Sea depended on weather, daylight, and local conditions. During part of the year, some groups stayed close to home, tending farms, fishing, repairing ships, and preparing goods. During the warmer months, travel became easier and more predictable. That rhythm encouraged flexible activity. A successful crew did not have to choose once and for all between raiding and trading. It could exploit opportunities as they came. A river system might offer access to markets one year and a route for attack the next. A coastal town that had been threatened might later become useful as a place to buy supplies. Scandinavian power grew partly because it was mobile enough to shift between these roles. This is one reason the Viking Age cannot be understood as a simple collapse of order into chaos. The same practical skills that made raids possible also made exchange possible. Knowledge of tides, currents, harbors, and ship handling had military value, but it also supported commerce. A shallow draft vessel could approach a beach, enter a river, or be hauled over short land routes between watersheds. That flexibility enlarged the number of places Scandinavians could reach and the number of things they could do once they arrived. It also meant that local populations were not dealing only with armed attackers. They were dealing with men who might return with goods to sell, with information, with alliances, or with demands for tribute. Over time, that broader range of contact changed both sides of the exchange. As these networks grew, some Scandinavian groups became more deeply involved in settlement and local politics abroad, while others continued to move in and out of trading and raiding circuits. The important point is that the Viking world was never limited to a single mode of action. Its strength came from combining movement with adaptation. That combination explains how northern seafarers could disrupt coasts, profit from markets, and create new footholds in distant places. It also prepares the next stage of the story, because once temporary visits began turning into repeated contact, the line between raiding ground and homeland started to blur. The growth of Viking overseas settlements began in the Irish Sea world, where repeated voyages turned into something more lasting. Scandinavian seafarers who had first come as raiders began, in some places, to return with families, livestock, tools, and household goods. That change mattered. A raid could end in a day. A settlement required planning, labor, and a reason to stay. Sheltered anchorages, fertile ground, access to fishing, and control of sea routes all made certain places attractive. Over time, the same ships that had carried attackers now carried people who intended to remain. In the late 8th and 9th centuries, the coasts and islands of Ireland and Western Britain saw repeated Scandinavian attacks. At first, the pattern was familiar: land quickly, strike, and withdraw. But geography made some places more than targets. The islands and sea locks of the Scottish West, including the Hebrides and nearby districts, provided harbours and useful positions along sea routes. In Ireland, Scandinavian groups began to establish more durable bases, especially around sites that would later become important towns. Dublin is the clearest example. It began in the 9th century as a Viking base and developed into a major urban centre. Its growth shows how a strategic foothold could become a lasting settlement tied to trade, warfare, and local politics. A similar pattern appeared farther north, where seaborne travel mattered more than overland movement. Orkney and Shetland became especially important because they sat on routes between Scandinavia, the North Atlantic, and the British Isles. To sailors already used to moving by ship, these islands were not distant edges of the world, they were stepping stones. Settlement there created bases for further movement, but it also created new communities. Scandinavian newcomers mixed with existing populations in different ways from place to place, and the archaeological evidence points to variation rather than a single uniform model. In some areas, local traditions continued alongside imported customs. In others, the balance changed more decisively. The North Atlantic islands also help explain why overseas settlement attracted more than warriors. In some cases, land pressure in Scandinavia may have been important. In others, political circumstances encouraged migration, though the details are not always certain. Later medieval accounts of the settlement of Iceland are valuable, but they were written long after the events they describe, so they must be used carefully. Even so, they reflect a larger historical reality. Scandinavian society had developed the ships, navigational habits, and coastal experience needed not only for raiding, but for moving households to new places. A vessel that could bring fighters to a monastery could also carry families to a new shore. That pattern extended to the Faroes and then to Iceland. These islands were not conquered in the way a mainland kingdom might be conquered. They were occupied by communities arriving by sea and organizing themselves around farms, livestock, and the seasonal demands of a new environment. Settlement required a different sort of effort from raiding. People had to divide land, secure grazing rights, and adjust to conditions that could be difficult and unfamiliar. Iceland in particular had no older royal power waiting to absorb the newcomers. That made its settlement distinctive. It was not simply an extension of Scandinavian rule, it became the basis for a new society formed through migration. These settlements also changed the older Viking homelands. Reports of usable land, safe harbors, and successful colonies encouraged further movement. A base in one region could support more voyages, and those voyages could strengthen a wider network of families, allies, merchants, and fighters. Some settlers stayed connected to Scandinavia through trade and marriage. Others became more independent as distance grew. Either way, the result was a broader Scandinavian world. By the time permanent communities existed in the Scottish Islands, parts of Ireland, and the far North Atlantic, the Viking Age was no longer only a story of raids launched from Scandinavia. It was also a story of households, farms, and new communities established far from the fjords and valleys where those seafarers had first lived. The Danelaw in England grew out of Viking settlement in the east and north of the country. Those regions were closest to the North Sea routes, and they were also part of a fragmented political landscape made up of older kingdoms, church estates, and local rulers. That made them easier to raid, but it also made them easier to negotiate with, occupy, and eventually hold. The story of the Danelaw is not the story of one swift conquest. It is the story of repeated campaigns, local bargains, and a slow change in who controlled land. By the later 9th century, large parts of eastern and northern England had come under Scandinavian influence. The term Danelaw is a later label, but it reflects a real historical pattern. It is usually understood to mean a region where Danish law or custom held sway, although the surviving evidence shows a more complicated reality than the name suggests. This was not a single kingdom with one capital and one clear administration. It was a broad zone in which Scandinavian settlers, English communities, and competing rulers all had to adjust to new conditions. In some places, older elites remained in place and adapted. In others, new landholders arrived and took the lead. The most important change was not only who fought there, but how land was governed after the fighting ended. That shift depended on settlement. Raiding could bring portable wealth, especially silver, but lasting power depended on farms, rents, and local obligations. Once Scandinavian groups established themselves in England, they needed to organize the countryside in ways that could support households, horses, and armed followings. One of the clearest signs of this deeper settlement is the place name evidence. Names ending in by, thorp, and related forms are often taken as signs of Scandinavian-speaking settlers, especially in the east and north. That evidence does not prove a single wave of colonists in every district, but it does show that settlement became durable enough to leave a lasting mark on the map. The landscape itself began to record political change. Landholding also required negotiation. Some Scandinavian leaders accepted tribute and local boundaries. Others were granted land after military success. Over time, men who had begun as raiders could become lords with an interest in stability. That is one reason the Danelaw matters in English history. It was not simply a zone of destruction, it became a functioning political order. People needed to know whose law applied, who collected dues, who judged disputes, and which leaders could call men to arms. In many places, older English institutions survived, but they now operated alongside Scandinavian customs and authorities. The result was not disappearance, but adjustment and gradual blending. The material record supports that picture, though unevenly. Burials, coin finds, inscriptions, and settlement patterns all suggest contact between Scandinavian and English practices. Some people adopted new styles while keeping older ones. In some areas, Christian burial continued. In others, funerary customs changed. The pace of change varied from place to place, and historians are careful not to impose one simple model on every site. What is clear is that people were not only contesting territory, they were also learning how to live in it. Marriages, trade, and everyday local ties could soften the line between conqueror and conquered. Over a generation or two, that line could become harder to trace. This was especially visible in the north and east, where Scandinavian power lasted longest. York became a major centre, and the region around it shows how military occupation could become ordinary government. Towns mattered because they were places of trade, taxation, and authority. The countryside mattered because it supplied food and manpower. Together they made permanent rule possible. Once Scandinavian rulers could hold both, they were no longer only arriving from the sea, they were governing a territorial base inside England itself. The Danelaw also changed politics farther south. It created pressure for other English rulers to adapt, because no king in the south could ignore a powerful northern and eastern bloc. Some local leaders within the Danelaw entered alliances with English kings, others resisted. The borders shifted, but the larger pattern remained. Part of England was now governed through Scandinavian power structures, even while older English traditions continued around them. That is why the Danelaw is best understood not as a brief occupation, but as a mixed political landscape that lasted long enough to shape law, speech, landholding, and identity. By the end of this stage, eastern and northern England were no longer just exposed shorelines. They were inhabited, governed, and disputed by communities with Scandinavian roots. Some were recent arrivals, some were local people under new rulers, and many were something in between. That blending of conquest and settlement helped turn Viking activity from a series of raids into a more lasting presence in England, and it set the stage for the struggles that followed elsewhere in the island. Alfred of Wessex became the central figure in the English response to the Vikings because he ruled one of the few kingdoms that still had room to recover. By the late 807 Sepeth, by the late 800 Mercic Mercic, but like la 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 that Rolf. Alfred's most important achievement was not a single battle, though one victory would later become famous in memory. It was the patient building of a system that could keep a kingdom alive. Contemporary English sources, especially the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Alfred's own writings, show a ruler concerned with law, administration, and military readiness. Later tradition expanded his image into that of a solitary genius, but the historical record is more practical than heroic. Alfred depended on officials, landholders, local men, and a structure of obligations that could be tightened when needed. His response to Viking pressure worked because it connected military defense to royal authority. One part of that response was the burh system. A burh was a fortified place, usually placed so that settlements, roads and river crossings could be defended with less delay than before. Some burhs were old Roman sites, others were newly organized centers. Their purpose was not only to survive an attack, but to prevent attackers from moving freely through the kingdom. If raiders had to face defended points rather than open countryside, their advantage shrank. The burhs also helped support markets and administration, so military reform and political control moved together. In time, these fortified towns became lasting features of the English landscape and government. Alfred also adjusted how his forces were raised. English armies had long depended on the fyrd, a levy of local men. But that system had not been enough against mobile Scandinavian forces. Alfred's reforms are described in the later legal and administrative tradition associated with his reign, and modern historians generally see them as part of a broader effort to divide military service more carefully. Men could not simply be summoned in the old way and expected to cover everything. Some had to serve while others stayed behind to farm or guard local districts. The result was less dramatic than a battlefield legend, but more durable. Defense became organized, scheduled, and tied to landholding. The turning point often associated with Alfred came in 878, when he defeated the army of Guthrum at Edington. The exact details come mainly from English sources, so the battle's narrative should be read with care, but the outcome is clear enough. Alfred forced Guthrum into submission, and the following agreement led to Guthrum's baptism and a settlement that recognized a divide between Alfred's realm and Scandinavian-controlled territory. That did not end conflict. It did, however, establish that Wessex would survive. For the first time in years, an English kingdom had stopped the expansion of Viking rule and held its ground. That survival mattered beyond the boundaries of Wessex. It gave other English communities a model for recovery. It also showed that Scandinavian power in England was real, but not unlimited. The Danelaw remained, and northern leaders still commanded important territories, yet the southern kingdoms were no longer collapsing one after another. Instead, there was now a contest between a Scandinavian political presence in the north and east, and a revived English kingship in the south. Alfred's court also worked to strengthen the idea of kingship itself. He promoted learning, encouraged the translation of important Latin texts into Old English, and linked rule with Christian duty. That was not an ornamental program. It helped present resistance as legitimate and orderly, not merely local stubbornness. In a period when kings needed obedience across wider areas, written law, religious language, and administrative habit all became tools of survival. The English state did not emerge fully formed from these years, but it did become more capable of coordinated action. The pressure from the north did not disappear, and it was not confined to isolated raids anymore. Larger campaigns followed, including renewed Scandinavian incursions in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. But after Alfred, those campaigns met a different England. Fortified centers were more common, leadership was more organized, royal authority in the south had been damaged but not destroyed. From there, the English recovery would be slow and uneven, yet it had begun. The Great Heathen Army was the large Scandinavian force that entered England in 865, and it changed the character of Viking activity there. Earlier attacks in the 8th and early 9th centuries had often been seasonal raids, carried out by smaller groups that came for plunder and then withdrew. By the 860s, English writers were facing something different. These forces stayed longer, moved inland, and returned across several seasons. They were still made up of war bands rather than a single permanent state army, but they acted with a level of coordination that made them far more dangerous than the raids that had come before. The name Great Heathen Army comes from Anglo-Saxon sources, especially the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It reflects the fear and shock that the invasion created in England. Modern historians still use the term because it is useful, but it should not be taken too literally. The army was probably a coalition of leaders, followers, and allied groups who came together for a common campaign. It was a military force, but also a political one, shaped by alliances and opportunity. What made it significant was not only its size, but its ability to campaign repeatedly and adapt to local conditions. The invasion began in East Anglia in 865. According to English sources, the local rulers provided horses to the newcomers, and that detail helps explain how the campaign moved beyond the coast. Ships brought the force to England, but horses and roads allowed it to travel inland with greater speed. From East Anglia, the army moved north into Northumbria, where internal conflict had already weakened resistance. York fell in 866, and the Northumbrian kingdom was already under strain from its own political divisions. The Scandinavian leaders did not have to create every weakness themselves. They were often entering into kingdoms that were already unstable. That pattern mattered across England. The Great Heathen Army was not simply a military invasion, it exposed the lack of unity among the English kingdoms. Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex, and their smaller neighbours did not respond as one state. Some paid tribute, some fought, some changed rulers under pressure. The invaders could move from one kingdom to another, using winter quarters as a base, and then striking again when conditions allowed. Conquest was no longer a matter of one raid and one response. It required sustained pressure, bargaining, and the ability to take advantage of divided opposition. By 869 and 870, the army had turned south again and pressed hard on East Anglia. King Edmund was killed during that campaign, and his death later became central to Christian martyr tradition. The outline of the event is historical, but many of the details that survive about Edmund come from later religious writing, which often added dramatic or moral meaning. What is clear is that East Anglia was overrun and Scandinavian power advanced further. By this point, the English kingdoms were facing occupation in parts of the east and north, not just intermittent attacks from the sea. The same force then moved toward Wessex, where Alfred and his allies faced the strongest pressure. The fighting in 871 was serious and prolonged, but the outcome was not a simple story of either complete victory or total defeat. Battles were won and lost on both sides. The Scandinavian leaders also showed an ability to negotiate. At times they withdrew, regrouped, and returned later. At other times they accepted tribute or divided resources with local rulers. That flexibility made the invasion effective. It could raid, settle into winter quarters, bargain, and attack again when conditions were favorable. By the end of the 9th century, the Great Heathen Army had already altered English history. It showed that Scandinavian warfare could operate on a larger scale than the early coastal raids. It also showed that England could not assume the danger would disappear with the changing season. Kings had to think about taxes, fortifications, and military response across broader territories. Communities had to consider supply, loyalty, and garrisons, not only emergency defense. The result was not immediate collapse, but a new political landscape shaped by long pressure and repeated conflict. The army did not end the Viking Age in England, but it marked an important turn in it. Raiding had become invasion, and invasion was beginning to push kingdoms toward larger and more permanent forms of defense. While the armies and fleets in England were forcing rulers to adapt, something similar was happening closer to the Scandinavian homelands themselves. The Viking Age did not only widen the map outward, it also changed how power worked at home. In Norway, that shift was slow, uneven, and shaped by local rivalries that had existed long before any ruler could claim to speak for the whole land. For much of the early medieval period, Norway was not a single kingdom in any strong sense. It was a landscape of fjords, valleys, and coastal districts, each with its own leading families and local assemblies. Authority rested with chieftains who controlled land, followers, and access to resources. A man's standing depended on kinship ties, alliances, and the ability to reward loyalty. The sea connected these regions, but it also helped preserve their independence. Travel by water was often easier than travel overland, so power tended to be local, and local power could endure for generations. That said, Norway was not politically static. Competition among leading families encouraged larger forms of leadership. A successful chieftain might gather support from several districts, impose tribute, or use marriage and patronage to widen his influence. Raiding and trading abroad could strengthen those ambitions, because wealth acquired overseas could be used at home to hire followers and secure loyalty. In that sense, the Viking Age did not simply produce outward movement, it also fed the domestic competition that pushed some leaders toward kingship. Later tradition places Harald Fairhair at the center of that process. According to the medieval Icelandic sagas, he became the ruler who brought much of Norway under one crown after defeating rival kings and chieftains, sometimes with the dramatic detail of a vow not to cut his hair until he had succeeded. That story belongs to a later literary tradition, not to contemporary eyewitness reporting, so it has to be handled carefully. The sagas preserve memory, but they also shape that memory into a clear political tale. Modern historians generally treat Harald as a real ruler associated with the early consolidation of power, while recognizing that the precise scale and speed of his achievements are uncertain. What is less disputed is that kingship in Norway developed through a long process rather than a single conquest. Some rulers held sway over parts of the coast, others relied on tribute or on the support of powerful local men. Even where a king's authority was recognized, it did not erase older structures at once. Chieftains remained important, and in many places the balance between king and local elite continued to shift from one generation to the next. The title of king itself could mean different things in different districts. Sometimes it implied military leadership. Sometimes it meant arbitration among rivals. Sometimes it was simply the highest rank in a chain of local obligations. The landscape of Norway made central rule difficult. Mountains, fjords, and long distances limited the speed with which a ruler could enforce decisions. A king needed ships, trusted followers, and a network of loyal contacts to hold power beyond his immediate base. He also needed to demonstrate that his rule brought order, protection, and access to wealth. That is one reason royal authority was often tied to control of trade routes and meeting places. The king who could protect shipping, collect dues, and dominate strategic coastal zones had an advantage over rivals who depended only on local landholding. The growth of kingship also changed the political meaning of violence. Feuds and raids did not disappear, but they could now be used in the service of broader claims. A ruler who defeated a rival was not merely settling a private dispute. He was trying to establish precedents, demand obedience, and turn personal followings into something closer to territorial rule. That transition was gradual, and it was never complete in one stroke. Still, the direction is clear enough. Over time, some Norwegian leaders began to act less like the first among many chieftains and more like rulers with a claim over wider regions. The later history of Norway would continue to be shaped by that tension. Local independence remained strong, and royal power had to be built repeatedly, not assumed. But the age of purely scattered authority was starting to close. The old chieftain world had not vanished, yet it was now being pressed by rulers who wanted more than temporary allegiance. In Norway, as in other parts of Scandinavia, the Viking Age was becoming not only a story of movement across the sea, but also a story of consolidation at home. Denmark's Viking Age kingship becomes much easier to see at Jelling, where Gorm and Harald Bluetooth turned royal authority into something permanent. The sources are uneven, and the line of kings is not preserved in the kind of detail found in later medieval chronicles, but the surviving evidence makes one point clear enough. By the 10th century, Danish power was becoming more durable, more public, and more closely tied to a royal centre. Before that, kings in Denmark ruled in a practical and personal way. Their authority depended on alliances with leading families, on gift-giving, on military support, and on control of places that mattered for travel and trade. In Scandinavia, as elsewhere, kingship was not yet a fixed bureaucratic system. It was a working relationship between rulers and important local interests. A king could be strong, but that strength had to be maintained. It had to be recognized again and again. The earliest Danish ruler in the Jelling line who is securely remembered by name is Gorm, often called Gorm the Old. The evidence for his reign is limited, and much of what later tradition said about him comes through royal memory rather than contemporary narrative. Even so, his importance lies in the position he occupies in the story of Danish monarchy. He belongs to a moment when Denmark was no longer just a loose set of coastal lordships. It was beginning to act as a kingdom with a centre, and that centre became closely associated with Jelling in Jutland. At Jelling, the royal monuments were not only memorials, they were statements. The earlier of the two famous Runestones was set up by Gorm for his wife, Thyra, and it presents her as a woman worthy of honour and remembrance. The later and larger stone, raised by Harald Bluetooth, is far more explicit in its royal message. It commemorates his parents, says that he won all Denmark and Norway, and declares that he made the Danes Christian. That inscription is one of the key texts for the period, but it has to be read carefully. A royal monument is a claim, not a modern census or survey. Historians treat the reference to Norway with caution. Still, the stone shows that Danish kings were now presenting themselves in a lasting, public and political form. Harald Bluetooth's reign is often treated as a turning point because it brought several developments together. Royal authority became more visible. Defensive structures were built or reinforced. Christianity was promoted as part of kingship. Harald's name is linked to ring forts, though scholars still debate the degree of direct royal planning behind each example. The important point is that these fortifications reflect a more organized political reach than the older world of small-scale lordship. A ruler who could gather labor, resources, and skilled oversight for major construction was exercising a different kind of power. It was still personal monarchy, but it was becoming more territorial and more administrative. Christianity was central to that change. Conversion is sometimes described as a clean break, but in Denmark it was gradual and uneven. Some leading families accepted baptism for political reasons before Christian belief had become widespread. Missionary work had already been underway, including efforts connected to the Archdiocese of Hamburg-Bremen, but royal support gave the new religion lasting force. For a king, Christianity could provide more than spiritual legitimacy. It linked the ruler to a wider European order. It also brought literacy, ritual, and institutional support that could strengthen royal authority. In that sense, the new faith offered a language of rule. The old customs did not disappear at once. Burial practices, ritual behavior, and local loyalties changed at different speeds in different places. But the public signs of authority were changing. Runestones began to carry Christian wording. Royal claims were carved into stone rather than kept only in memory. Church building, episcopal organization, and new forms of record-keeping all helped make kingship less dependent on the immediate presence of the ruler. Conversion, therefore, had political effects as well as religious ones. It helped present the king as more than a successful war leader. He could now appear as a divinely supported monarch. The Jelling monuments capture that transition especially well. They stand between older Scandinavian forms of display and the newer Christian monarchy that was taking shape across Europe. They still belong to a world of kinship, honor, and elite remembrance, but they also point toward a kingdom that wanted to define itself in lasting and legible terms. A ruler could no longer rely only on battlefield success or household loyalty. He also had to show order, memory, and sanction. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth came to embody that shift. By the end of the 10th century, Danish kingship was still not centralized in the later medieval sense. Local elites remained important, and royal control could still be challenged. But the direction of change is plain. Denmark now had a stronger royal center, broader political ambitions, and monuments that announced those ambitions in stone. The age of scattered authority was giving way to a kingdom that could speak in its own name and increasingly place itself within Christian Europe. If Denmark shows one side of the Viking Age, the eastern rivers show another. Scandinavian expansion did not move only toward the North Sea, England, and Ireland. It also moved across the Baltic and deep into Eastern Europe, where waterways linked the northern forests to the Black Sea, the Caspian, and through them the markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world. Travel there was shaped by geography and profit. Rivers made movement possible, and once traders, raiders, and tribute collectors learned the routes, they could return to them year after year. The Eastern story begins with familiar Scandinavian strengths, ships, mobility, and local networks of power. But the terrain was different. In the west, seaborne groups could strike coasts and islands and then withdraw. In the east, long river routes encouraged another pattern. Boats moved inland. Men carried goods around rapids and shallows. Ports and portage points became important. Agreements with local communities mattered as well, because no one could simply dominate the whole landscape at once. Expansion here was not a single campaign. It was a gradual process of contact, exchange, pressure, and adaptation. Modern historians often use the term Varangians for the broader Scandinavian presence in the region. That term appears in later sources and in Byzantine usage, but it did not describe one tribe or one army. The people involved came from different parts of Scandinavia, especially areas linked to Sweden and the Baltic, and they took part in mixed communities along the route. Some were merchants, some were mercenaries, some were tribute takers, some were settlers. In practice, the line between trader and raider could be thin. A voyage that began as commerce might end in coercion, and a force that came for plunder might remain to control a crossing or collect dues. The rivers themselves made this possible. The Dnieper route led south toward the Black Sea. The Volga route led east toward the Caspian. Other waterways connected the Baltic to inland lakes and local power centers. These routes were difficult, but they were efficient in a pre-modern world. A shallow draft ship could be hauled, carried, or rowed where larger vessels could not go. That gave Scandinavian groups an advantage in landscapes where river traffic mattered more than open sea sailing. It also meant that control over movement mattered as much as control over territory. A group that held a landing, a portage, or a market point could influence a much wider region than its numbers might suggest. What made these routes especially valuable was the exchange they carried. Northern goods such as furs, honey, wax, iron, and slaves could move south or east. In return, Scandinavians obtained silver, textiles, weapons, jewelry, and prestige items from far beyond their homelands. Islamic silver, especially dirhams, circulated widely in northern hordes and has given historians important evidence for the scale of Eastern trade. These finds are not just signs of wealth, they show repeated and organized contact. They suggest that the Eastern routes were not marginal, they were central to the Viking economy. This movement also brought Scandinavians into close contact with Slavic-speaking communities and with steppe peoples who controlled parts of the borderlands. Those relationships were not fixed. In some places, Scandinavians traded with local groups. In others, they exacted tribute or served as military specialists. In still others, they were absorbed into the existing population over time. The Eastern world was politically fragmented, but it was not empty. It meant competition among local rulers, fortified settlements, river tolls, and rival claims over trade. Scandinavian groups entered that environment and learned to operate within it. The later chronicles about these beginnings are complicated. Some East Slavic traditions, especially the primary chronicle, present Scandinavian figures as founders or invited rulers in the region. Modern scholars debate the details because the sources were written later and often shape events into a story of origin and legitimacy. What does seem clear from archaeology, written records, and place names is that Scandinavians were present early, that they moved through these river corridors, and that they became part of the political development of the region. The exact balance between outside leadership and local formation is still discussed. The broader pattern is less disputed. Over time, the most important river centers grew into something more durable. Novgorod became a key northern base. Kiev emerged farther south as an important political and commercial center. These places sat at strategic points on routes that connected the Baltic to the wider world. Their growth did not happen all at once, and it did not depend on Scandinavians alone. Local Slavic populations remained essential, but Scandinavian elites, military followers, and traders played a visible role in shaping early rule, especially in the movement of goods and the collection of tribute. In that sense, the eastern expansion of the Viking Age was not a side story. It was one of the places where seaborne mobility helped build new political formations. This is why the Viking Age cannot be understood only as a northern assault on Western Europe. It was also a network of movement across Eurasia. The same habits that brought Scandinavian ships to English monasteries could also carry men and goods along the waterways of Russia and Ukraine towards cities and empires far beyond the North Sea. By the time these eastern routes were firmly established, Scandinavians were no longer simply raiders from the edge of Europe. They were participants in a larger commercial and political system, one that linked the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Islamic world. The river routes did not just move goods, they helped create new centers of power. Among the eastern routes of the Viking Age, few developments mattered more than the rise of Novgorod and Kiev. These were not just stops on a trade road. They became centers where power was organized, tribute was gathered, and rulers claimed authority over wide stretches of river country. Their rise depended on movement, boats on inland waterways, merchants carrying goods, armed retinues collecting dues, and local communities dealing with newcomers from the north. The hard question is how much of this world was Scandinavian and how much was local Slavic development. The most careful answer is that it was both. Medieval East Slavic chronicles, especially the primary chronicle, preserve a tradition linking early rule with Varangians, the Eastern term often used for Scandinavian arrivals. Modern historians do not treat those accounts as simple eyewitness reports, but they do see them as evidence that later rulers wanted to remember a founding role for northern elites. Archaeology, written sources, and the geography of the river routes all suggest that Scandinavians were present in meaningful numbers in the early trade and military environment. At the same time, the population was overwhelmingly local, and the political structures that emerged depended on cooperation with Slavic, Finnic, and other regional groups. Novgorod was one of the most important northern centers in this eastern system. Its position near headwaters and river connections made it valuable as a point of exchange between the Baltic and the interior. From there, goods could move south along chains of rivers and portages. The route linked fur lands, forest communities, and markets farther south. Kiev, farther down the Dnieper, became even more important as a political center. It stood at a junction linking the forest zone to the steppe and, eventually, to the Black Sea. Whoever controlled Kiev could influence traffic moving between northern Europe and the Byzantine world. The movement of Scandinavian groups into these regions was not a single migration in the modern sense. It was a series of repeated contacts that included trade, armed service, settlement, and local alliance. Some came for profit. Some may have served as followers of powerful leaders. Some settled into mixed communities and took part in collecting tribute from surrounding peoples. In the Eastern sources, this social world is often connected with the name Rus, a term whose original meaning is debated. Many scholars think it began as a label for Scandinavian-linked groups active in the Eastern river system, though the term soon broadened and came to describe the ruling population of a larger realm. What matters most is that the label came to denote a political order, not just an ethnic origin. The practical basis of that order was river travel. These traders and warriors did not need to cross a wide ocean every time. They used long, narrow boats suited to shallow water, overland portages, and the great river corridors south, that made it possible to connect places that would otherwise have remained distant. The Eastern Viking world was less like a chain of colonies than a network of routes and strongpoints. Control of movement mattered as much as control of land. Written sources for the earliest period must be handled carefully. The primary chronicle, composed in Kiev in the early 12th century, gives a shaped account of the past. It names rulers such as Rurik, Oleg, and Igor in a narrative of dynastic beginnings. Some of this may preserve historical memory. Some may reflect later efforts to explain the legitimacy of ruling families. The broad pattern, however, is supported by other evidence. Scandinavian names appear in elite contexts. Burial sites show northern connections, and eastern trade routes clearly carried people as well as goods. The precise details remain debated, but the overall movement from mobile bands to governing elites is not. Oleg's seizure of Kiev, as remembered in the chronicle tradition, symbolized the shift from northern river movement to southern political ambition. Whether every element of the story is exact is uncertain, but the larger idea fits the evidence. Control of Kiev created a stronger base for collecting tribute and managing commerce. Later rulers could use that position to negotiate with Byzantium and to extend influence over neighboring groups. The result was a principality that was not Scandinavian in any simple sense, yet still carried marks of Scandinavian participation in its earliest elite culture. By the 10th century, these eastern polities had become part of a larger diplomatic and commercial world. The Rus appear in Byzantine records, and their rulers engaged in treaties, warfare, and trade with imperial authorities. They moved along the same broad system that linked the Baltic to the Black Sea. Furs, wax, honey, metals, and slaves circulated through it, though the exact balance changed over time. The economic value of the routes helped stabilize political power. Leaders who could protect traders, tax movement, and maintain armed followings gained advantages over their rivals. In that sense, Novgorod and Kiev show the Viking Age at its most transformative. Scandinavian migrants did not simply arrive, raid, and leave. In the east, they became embedded in a landscape of river towns, tribute networks, dynastic politics, and local society. Over time, the political formations that grew there outlasted the narrow identity of the first northern groups involved. What began as mobility across waterways became something more durable: rulers, towns, and institutions tied to a wider eastern world. The North Atlantic voyages carried Scandinavian settlers into the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland in the late 9th and 10th centuries. These were not sudden mass migrations in a modern sense. They were gradual movements by families and groups responding to limited land at home, changing political conditions, and the opportunities created by long-distance seafaring. Some people left Western Norway because inheritance practices broke holdings into smaller pieces. Some were responding to rising royal power. Others may have been escaping conflict. The surviving evidence does not let us measure the balance precisely, but it does show that voyaging had become routine enough to support settlement, not only raiding and trade. The Faroes were among the earliest islands to be occupied. Their early settlement is less fully documented than Iceland's, but they clearly fit the wider Scandinavian pattern of maritime expansion. They offered grazing land and a useful position along North Atlantic routes. From there, movement could continue farther west. Iceland became the most important of these new settlements. Later Icelandic written sources, especially the Sagas and Landnámabók, describe settlers arriving in the late 9th century and preserve names, family lines, and stories of first occupation. Those texts are valuable, but they are not simple contemporary records. Archaeology and environmental evidence support the general outline of settlement, even where some saga details reflect later memory. Taken together, the evidence points to colonization by people from Norway, along with significant contributions from Norse communities already established in the British Isles, where Scandinavian and Gaelic worlds had begun to overlap. Iceland drew settlers for a practical reason. It had usable land, but no established kingdom with a strong ruler already in place. That made it available to independent households that could bring livestock, tools, and enough labor to establish farms. The climate was harsher than in much of Scandinavia, and adaptation was necessary from the start. Settlers built farms, kept animals, and depended on a seasonal mix of grazing, fishing, and gathering. The settlement pattern was spread around the coasts and through the more usable inland valleys, where water, pasture, and routes of movement could support a household. This created a society assembled from family connections and local alliances rather than inherited from an older state. The voyage to Iceland depended on skills that had been built up long before the first permanent settlers left Norway. Sail and oar, timber construction, knowledge of winds, and practical navigation all mattered. Mariners had to read currents, weather, birds, and landmarks at sea. They also needed ships that could be beached or moved in shallow water, which made it possible to carry animals, household goods, and building materials to places with few prepared harbors. The sea was a barrier, but it was also a route. Once Scandinavians had enough experience crossing it, distance became something they could manage. Greenland marked the farthest extension of this western movement. The first Norse settlements there are usually associated with Eric the Red, whose exile from Iceland is described in later Icelandic tradition. The broad outline is likely sound, even if the dramatic details are less secure. Around the late 10th century, settlers established communities on Greenland's southwest coast, where conditions allowed limited farming and direct access to the sea. This was not a settlement of the whole island, it was a narrow coastal presence, dependent on adaptation to a difficult environment. The colonies stayed connected to Iceland and Norway, and they relied on trade that could justify the long voyage. Walrus ivory became especially important, along with hides and other northern products. In return, the settlers needed timber, iron, grain, and manufactured goods that Greenland could not supply in sufficient quantity. That trade gave Greenland a place in a wider Atlantic economy. It also shows that Viking expansion was not only about taking territory, it was about finding places where distance itself could be useful. A settlement on the edge of the known world could still matter if it linked rare resources to markets that valued them. At the same time, life in Greenland remained fragile. The margin between workable farm life and hardship was narrow. The Norse communities there survived for centuries, but they were always exposed to environmental limits, shipping problems, and changes in northern trade. Their history belongs as much to long adaptation as to expansion. Seen together, Iceland and Greenland make the pattern clear. Scandinavian movement across the North Atlantic was not random drift. It followed established routes, depended on shipbuilding and navigation skills, and answered specific pressures and incentives. Some migrants were pushed by competition and kingship at home. Others were pulled by land, trade, and the possibility of greater independence. The islands they reached were not empty in a simple sense, and there may have been earlier visits or occasional contacts, though the evidence for sustained pre-Scandinavian settlement is limited. The Norse, however, were the first to create durable communities there. They turned remote landfalls into lived societies. By the end of this movement, the Viking world had reached its western Atlantic edge. It did not end raiding, trade, or politics in Scandinavia itself, but it added a chain of frontier settlements stretching far beyond the North Sea. Those communities would develop in their own way, and in Iceland especially, they would preserve memories and institutions that remain among the richest surviving evidence for the age. Iceland's Viking Age society grew out of farms, kin groups, and law, not out of kingship. There was no monarch on the island, and no older local nobility already fixed in place in the way many parts of Scandinavia had them. Power rested instead with household heads, with people who could attract followers, and with those who could turn land, family ties, and legal skill into influence. The settlement of Iceland began in the later 9th century, and the tradition preserved in Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, names many of the early settlers and the lands they claimed. That work was written down later, so historians use it carefully, but it still reflects an important reality. Iceland was settled quickly by people bringing Norwegian and North Atlantic habits into a place without towns, without a king, and without a deep inherited hierarchy. That absence of central rule shaped daily life from the start. Land was the main source of security and standing. In a wide island with scattered settlement, a household had to defend its claims on its own terms. Farming was possible, but only within limits. In most regions, grain growing was difficult, so people relied more on livestock, haymaking, fishing, and movement between different kinds of land through the year. The farmstead was therefore more than a dwelling. It was an economic base, a legal position, and the center of labor. Around it formed a society built on practical alliances, marriage-linked families, trade-connected distant districts, and disputes could continue for years if they were not brought to settlement. That is why law became so central in Iceland. Without a king to impose decisions from above, the community needed a public way to handle conflict. The key institution was the Alþingi, or Althing, founded in the 10th century. It was an assembly rather than a parliament in the modern sense, but it brought leading men and legal experts together at regular intervals. Laws were spoken, remembered, and debated there. Cases were heard, agreements were arranged, Violence did not disappear, but it existed within a legal framework that people recognized as real. Some of the early legal material survives only through later manuscript tradition, especially the Gregos texts, so the exact wording of the first rules is not always secure. The broader pattern, however, is clear. Iceland depended on public law because it had no monarchic center. That legal order also shaped competition among elites. In a society without a king, status depended on followers, reputation, and the ability to function as a godi, or chieftain, in alliance with others. A godi was not a territorial lord in the later feudal sense. The role combined political, legal, and at times religious influence, though the old pagan element should not be overstated once Christianity began to spread. Power was personal and networked. A household could attach itself to a leader for protection and advantage, and leaders built support by helping in disputes, rewarding loyalty, and speaking effectively in assembly. The result was a politics of local rivalry that could be intense, but also highly procedural. It was not rule by a central state, it was rule through negotiated balance. In that setting, memory mattered. Iceland developed a strong culture of genealogy, legal recall, and oral narrative, because families needed to know who they were, where their rights lay, and which claims could still be defended. Much later, in the 13th century, Icelanders wrote down the great saga literature that now defines much of the island's reputation. Those sagas are not simple records of the settlement age. They are literary works shaped by later concerns, and modern scholars do not treat them as direct eyewitness accounts. Even so, they draw on older oral material, family traditions, and a society that valued ancestry and public reputation. The saga landscape was therefore created long before the sagas were written. Law, household, and lineage had already made memory into a social tool. The result was a distinctly Icelandic form of Scandinavian life. It preserved older northern patterns, but it also changed them. In Norway and Denmark, growing royal power would eventually draw local elites into larger kingdoms. In Iceland, no king succeeded in doing that. A dispersed society took shape instead, organized around farms, assemblies, and influential families. It stayed connected to the Norwegian world through trade and migration, but its institutions developed under different pressures. That difference is one reason Iceland later became so important to historians. Because the island stood apart from royal centers, it preserved family politics, settlement memory, and legal practice in forms that are often more visible than in places absorbed more fully into kingdoms. By the time this pattern had settled in, Iceland was no longer just a remote settlement. It was a working society with rules, rivalries, and a shared memory of origin. People lived by livestock, law, and local alliance, while the assembly gave them a place to turn conflict into process. That was the foundation for later saga culture, and it is why Iceland came to represent a Viking world organized without a king, but not without order. Conversion to Christianity did not come to the north as a single, sudden decision. It spread unevenly through contact, persuasion, politics, and the practical advantages of belonging to the Christian world. By the late Viking Age, Scandinavian rulers were dealing with already Christian kingdoms, and that mattered. Baptism could strengthen ties with powerful neighbors, improve access to trade, and present a ruler in a language European courts understood. Conversion was religious, but it was also diplomatic. In many places it began among kings and elites, then slowly moved into wider society. The clearest early evidence comes from inscriptions, church foundations, burial remains, and later written accounts. Those sources show that Christianity did not erase older practice overnight. For a time, people seem to have used Christian names, prayers, or burial forms while keeping older customs in other parts of life. The transition was uneven because Scandinavia itself was uneven. Powerful households, trading towns, and royal centers changed first. More distant farming communities often changed later, and older beliefs could remain visible for generations. Modern historians therefore treat conversion not as a clean break, but as a long adjustment in which old and new practices overlap. Missionaries played a real role, though their work often depended on rulers. The church brought bishops, priests, liturgy, and a wider international framework. It also brought literacy in Latin, which gave kings a new way to record authority and connect with the larger Christian world. In Denmark, Norway, and parts of the Swedish sphere, rulers supported missionaries when it helped them consolidate power. Christianity could undermine local rivals, reduce the independence of older cult sites, and place royal authority under divine approval. That did not mean everyone welcomed the change. Conversion could provoke resistance, especially where it seemed to threaten custom or ancestral memory. Still, the political advantages of Christian kingship were hard to ignore. The Frankish world had already shown how conversion could be tied to state power. By this period, English and continental rulers were part of a Christian political order that extended beyond any single kingdom, that mattered for Scandinavians who traded, raided, or settled abroad. Merchants found that Christian identity could ease travel and negotiation. Rulers found that baptism opened doors to alliance and marriage. Even where violence remained common, Christianity created a shared framework for diplomacy. Over time, that framework became harder to resist than to adopt. Burial practice gives some of the clearest signs of the shift. Older Scandinavian graves sometimes included weapons, goods, or burial forms linked to pre-Christian belief. Christian burial moved towards simpler interment and churchyard space. The change did not happen everywhere at once, and archaeologists have to be cautious about reading too much into a single grave. But across many regions, the broad pattern is visible. The dead were being placed into a new religious order, and that changed how communities understood memory, ancestry, and status. Burial was no longer only a family act. It was becoming part of a Christian landscape. Law changed as well. Once rulers and assemblies accepted Christianity, it influenced marriage rules, inheritance, and the public handling of oath and witness. In some places, older law codes were adjusted to reflect church teaching. This was not only about belief, it helped create more predictable forms of rule. Christian institutions offered record-keeping, clerical expertise, and a moral language kings could use when they wanted obedience. In return, rulers could protect the church and use it as part of their own authority. There was also a wider international meaning. As Scandinavian kingdoms became more visibly Christian, they were less isolated from the rest of medieval Europe. They could be treated as more legitimate participants in diplomacy, marriage politics, and trade. They could also send and receive clergy, books, and royal models of government. This mattered in places like Denmark and Norway, where kings were trying to build authority over larger territories. It also mattered in the East, where contact through trade routes brought Scandinavian elites into Christian and non-Christian worlds alike. Conversion helped define who belonged to the emerging political order and who stood outside it. At the same time, older beliefs did not simply disappear. The sources show overlap, adaptation, and selective adoption. Some practices may have continued under new names. Some images and symbols were reused in Christian contexts. Some traditions survived in memory long after they had lost public authority. Later sagas often describe dramatic moments of conversion, but those stories were written down much later and usually compress a slow process into a sharper narrative. For that reason, the safest conclusion is also the most accurate one. Christianity became dominant, not because every older custom vanished, but because it steadily became the framework through which rulers, laws, and public identity were organized. By this stage, the Viking world was changing from within. The same societies that had once been defined by maritime movement, local power, and flexible allegiance were now being drawn into Christian kingdoms with broader institutions. That did not end older northern life at once. It did, however, begin to reorder it. Burial, law, kingship, and foreign relations all moved in the same direction, and the old beliefs that had shaped the Viking Age gradually lost their public center. If Christianity gradually became the public framework of Viking Age societies, daily life was still shaped by older practical concerns. Most people did not spend their days thinking about kings or distant raids. They worked the land, maintained households, traded goods, repaired tools, raised children, and endured winters that could be long and demanding. The Viking Age depended on movement and conflict, but it was sustained by farming, craft, and family labor. In Scandinavia itself, settlement usually clustered where land and water could support ordinary life. Farms were often small by modern standards, though some elite estates were larger and more closely tied to local power. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, people relied on mixed farming. They kept cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and they grew barley, rye, and sometimes oats, depending on local conditions. In many places, the soil was thin and the growing season short, so the margin between success and failure was narrow. That made livestock, stored grain, and careful seasonal planning essential. Hay had to be cut and saved for winter fodder. Buildings had to be repaired before cold weather set in. Fishing, hunting, and gathering also mattered, especially in coastal and northern regions where farming alone was not enough. The homes people lived in reflected those conditions. The familiar longhouse, known from archaeology across parts of the Scandinavian world, was not a single fixed design but a group of building types adapted to local needs. Many homes were built with timber where wood was available, while in other places turf and stone were used alongside timber framing. Inside, a household might combine sleeping space, storage, work areas, and animal shelter in one extended structure or in a cluster of buildings. Fire was central. It provided heat, cooking, light, and a place for daily tasks. Smoke, draft, and maintenance were part of ordinary life. These were practical shelters that had to be kept in use constantly. Food depended on season and status. Dairy products were important in many farm communities, as were meat, fish, porridge, bread, and preserved foods. Salted, dried, or smoked ingredients helped people carry food through the year. In coastal settlements, fish could be a major part of the diet, while inland communities relied more heavily on livestock and grain. Wealth changed the range of what people could eat, but the basic pattern was shaped by preservation and storage rather than abundance. Feasting existed, especially among the elite, but it rested on the ordinary labor of farms and households. Clothing also followed practical needs. Wool was widely used, and linen was valuable where it could be produced or acquired. Garments had to keep people warm, allow work, and last through repeated use. Archaeological finds show needles, combs, brooches, belts, and fasteners that were both useful and expressive. Clothing could signal status, wealth, region, and sometimes wider trade connections, but for most people it was first of all durable. The same is true of shoes, cloaks, and layered garments suited to wet and cold climates. Much of this labor was organized through households rather than formal institutions. Family ties mattered, and so did dependence within the farmstead. Men and women both contributed to the survival of the home, though their roles were often divided by task, age, and local custom. In the written sources, especially the later Icelandic sagas, women sometimes appear as managers of household resources, negotiators within kin networks, and protectors of family honor. Archaeology supports the importance of women in domestic production, textile work, storage, and household continuity, even though the exact division of labor varied. The sources do not present a single simple model, and modern historians are careful not to project later assumptions too confidently onto the past. What is clear is that Viking Age society depended on work that was domestic as well as maritime. Craft production connected the household world to larger networks. Ironworking, carpentry, bone carving, weaving, leatherworking, pottery in some regions, and ship-related trades all had their place. Some crafts were carried out on farms, while others concentrated in settlements and market sites. A smith who could make nails, tools, fittings, and weapons served both local and wider needs. A textile worker could produce cloth that became clothing, sails, or trade goods. These skills mattered because they supported everyday survival, but they also connected communities to exchange networks that stretched across the North Sea, the Baltic, and beyond. The same society that could send ships abroad also had to make rope, mend sails, shape timber, and maintain equipment at home. The rhythm of the year structured life. Spring brought preparation and repair. Summer was the season for travel, trade, fishing, building, and in some cases raiding. Autumn was for harvest, slaughtering, storage, and getting ready for winter. Winter did not mean complete inactivity, but it did change the balance of work. People gathered indoors more often, and many tasks shifted to maintenance, weaving, tool repair, and planning. In harsher regions, survival depended on anticipating what the coming season would require. The calendar was practical before it was literary. It marked labor, not leisure. This everyday world also included children, apprenticeship, and the gradual transfer of knowledge. Skills were learned by doing. Farming, sailing, ironwork, weaving, and legal memory were all embedded in daily practice. A young person growing up in the Viking Age entered a world where survival depended on remembering roots, maintaining alliances, knowing when to plant and when to store, and understanding how the household fit into a larger kin group. The public stories of kings and warriors rested on that quieter foundation. Seen this way, the Viking Age was not an age of constant motion alone. It was a lived society made up of farms, workshops, storerooms, boats, and households. Even in places touched by conquest or settlement abroad, people had to build lives from ordinary materials. They needed food, shelter, clothing, and labor before they could sustain trade, politics, or war. That practical world gave the Viking Age its stability, and it made expansion possible in the first place. As households grew and travel widened, another kind of order became necessary. A farming settlement, a trading harbor, or a migrating band could not function on kinship alone. Disputes over land, compensation, inheritance, insults, and injury had to be settled in a way that people would accept, or else every disagreement could turn into a cycle of revenge. In the Viking world, that need gave authority to law and to assembly. The central institution was the thing, the public meeting where free men gathered to hear cases, settle conflicts, and make decisions. The exact form varied from place to place, but the principle was broadly shared across Scandinavia and the regions shaped by Scandinavian settlement. Important matters were not supposed to remain private. They were brought before a community, spoken aloud, witnessed and judged through negotiation. Law depended on memory as much as on writing, because written legal codes were limited in the early period. Men who could recite customary rules, recall precedents, and remember the obligations of different families held real influence. In that sense, legal authority was a public craft. This did not mean that Viking society was peaceful or equal. Violence remained part of political life, and the threat of force stood behind many agreements. But force was rarely enough by itself. A killing could set off a feud, and feud could spread through allied households if there was no settlement. Compensation offered one way out. The payment known in English as wergild or manprice appears in several early medieval legal traditions, though exact forms differed by region and status. A nobleman, a free farmer, or a dependent person did not carry the same value in law. That difference shows how social rank was built into the legal system. Compensation could help close a conflict, but only if both sides accepted the terms and if influential witnesses stood by the agreement. Assemblies also made authority visible. A chieftain, king, or local ruler could not simply declare power in the abstract. He needed support from people who controlled land, followers, and local enforcement. That made politics a negotiation. Leaders gathered backing by rewarding allies, hosting retainers, protecting trade, or adjudicating disputes. Their position depended on reputation, but also on performance. They had to show that they could keep order, settle claims, and distribute favors without losing the confidence of those around them. In some places, especially where kingship was still developing, this balance remained unstable for generations. That is one reason legal custom mattered so much in the Viking Age. It gave communities a framework that could survive mobility and conflict. A ship crew, a trading partnership, or a settlement abroad still needed rules for property, inheritance, and violence. The same was true in the expanding Scandinavian world overseas. Once people left their home districts and began building new communities in places such as the British Isles, Iceland, or the North Atlantic Islands, they brought law with them because law made settlement possible. It defined landholding, fixed obligations, and gave strangers a way to become neighbors without constant bloodshed. The evidence for this world comes from several kinds of sources. Later law codes, especially from the Christian period, preserve older customs in adapted form. Saga literature, which was written down much later, reflects memory and literary shaping, so it must be used carefully. At the same time, runic inscriptions, place names, and archaeological evidence show that legal and political identity were not abstract ideas. They were embedded in public life. Runestones sometimes memorialize disputes, inheritances, or status claims. Assemblies left their mark in meeting places and regional centers where people gathered year after year. Even when the surviving evidence is incomplete, it points to a society that expected decisions to be spoken, witnessed, and remembered. This system did not remove conflict, and it was never perfectly consistent. Powerful men could bend outcomes, and weaker people did not always receive fair treatment. Still, the pattern is clear. Viking society was not governed only by raids, kings, or swords. It also depended on custom, witness, compensation, and public agreement. That legal habit helped hold together farms, fleets, and settlements across a wide and changing world. By the time Scandinavian expansion reached its farthest edges, the ability to make and enforce order through assembly had become as important as the ability to fight. Alongside law and memory, the Viking Age left a rich material record. Some objects were practical, some ornamental, and many were both. A carved handle, a brooch, a decorated sword hilt, or the remains of a ship each tells historians something different about the people who made and used them. These finds do not speak with the certainty of a written chronicle, but they do reveal skill, wealth, identity, and belief in Scandinavian and Viking Age communities. Runestones are among the best-known examples. They are especially common in Denmark and Sweden, though they appear elsewhere as well. Many were raised in the late Viking Age and early Christian period, when elite families wanted public monuments that could preserve a name, mark inheritance, or display loyalty. The inscriptions are usually brief, but often precise enough to identify the person who commissioned the stone, the person being remembered, and sometimes the relationship between them. A stone might say that a son raised a memorial for a father, or that a family had lost a member far from home. Some mention travel to the west or east. Others refer to Christian formulas and crosses. Taken together, they show that commemoration was public, visible, and meant to endure. The stones also reveal status. To carve and raise a runestone required labor, and in many cases wealth. Some are simple, Others are elaborate with interlaced designs, animals, and bands of text arranged around the image field. The message was not only in the words. The monument itself declared that a family could command artisans, stone, and attention. In that sense, a runestone was both a memorial and a statement of rank, marking a place in the social order. The style of the carving also matters. Viking Age art did not follow a single fixed pattern. It changed over time and varied by region. Scholars usually describe several overlapping styles based on animal ornament, spiral forms, gripping beasts, and later more refined interlace. These styles appear on runestones, metal fittings, wooden objects, and ornamental fragments from burials or settlements. They help historians see a shared visual language across the north while also showing local preference and change over time. Metalwork appears in many forms. Jewelry was important not just as decoration but as a sign of social position and exchange. Penannular brooches, arm rings, pins, and necklaces could signal rank, family connections, or access to imported materials. Silver was especially significant. It circulated in ingot form, in cut pieces, and in ornaments that could also function as stores of value. Wealth could be worn, given away, buried, or cut into pieces for payment. The same object could move between ornament and currency depending on circumstance. Hoards make that clear. Silver, coins, hack silver, and jewelry have been found across Scandinavia and in Viking Age regions beyond it. Some hoards were hidden in times of insecurity. Others may have been stored for later use or placed as offerings. Because many contain mixed material from different places, they show the reach of Viking trade and travel as well as the value placed on precious metal. Some include Islamic silver dirhams, which traveled north through eastern routes. Others contain Anglo-Saxon or Carolingian coinage. The result is a record of contact that is both economic and cultural, linking markets, raids, tribute, and gift-giving. Woodworking was equally important, though wood survives less often than stone or metal. What remains suggests a high level of craftsmanship. Tools, furniture, ship fittings, posts, and architectural fragments show that carpentry was essential to daily life. In burials and wet archaeological deposits, carved wooden objects preserve details of style that are otherwise lost. The Oseberg burial, for example, contained finely worked wood carving, including decorative pieces that reflect elite craft production in Norway. It is unusual and cannot stand for every household, but it does show the range of skill available to patrons who could commission elaborate work. In more ordinary settings, wooden bowls, barrels, and structural timbers would have been central to farm life and travel alike. Ship decoration belongs to the same world. Viking ships were built for function, but they were also prestige objects. A well-made vessel represented resources, labor, and command. Decorative elements on ships, whether on prows, fittings, or carved details, could heighten that sense of status. The ship itself carried a social message. A leader had enough skilled workers, timber, iron, rope, and sailcloth to put to sea. In some burials, ships became part of funerary display, though such practices varied by place and time and were not universal. Even where actual ships do not survive, impressions, fittings, and related finds remind us that maritime technology was both practical and symbolic. Clothing and personal objects also belonged to this material world. Buckles, combs, shears, needles, gaming pieces, weights, and balance scales speak to dress, grooming, trade, and leisure. Combs appear often in Viking Age archaeology, showing concern for personal care and routine. Weights and scales point to commercial exchange and careful valuation. Together, these objects make the period less abstract. They show households managing work, trade, and display at the same time. Religious change can be traced through material culture as well. Christian crosses appear on some runestones and jewelry. Burial practice changes in ways that suggest new beliefs about the body, the dead, and memory. At the same time, older forms did not disappear overnight. Some objects blend styles or symbols. This is one reason material evidence is so valuable. It captures transition without forcing it into a neat sequence. Conversion to Christianity was not simply a matter of replacing one set of signs with another. It unfolded unevenly, and objects show that older habits could continue alongside new ones. The broader pattern is clear. Runestones, jewelry, tools, carved wood, silver hoards, and ship fittings all belong to a society that expressed itself materially. Status was made visible. Belief was made visible. Trade was made visible. Even memory was made visible. These were not separate spheres. They were tied together in homes, on roads, at assemblies, in burial grounds, and at ports. The surviving objects are fragmentary, but they leave a durable trace of how people in the Viking Age wanted to be seen and remembered. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was no longer defined mainly by sudden coastal raids. The same seafaring skill that had once made surprise attacks possible was now being used by kings who wanted to hold territory, collect taxes, and enforce regular authority. In England, Denmark, Norway, and the eastern lands tied to the Rus, the balance was changing. Smaller warbands still mattered, but they were increasingly operating in a world where larger kingdoms were forming around them. Borders, fortifications, lineage, landholding, and royal authority mattered more. In England, the story was not simply one of Vikings against Anglo-Saxons, because by then the situation was more mixed than that. Scandinavian settlers had lived in the Danelaw for generations. Many descendants had become part of local society, and the region had developed shared language, custom, and law. But the political map kept shifting. English kings gradually regained control over areas that had once been under Scandinavian rule, and that recovery did not come from a single battle. It came through military pressure, negotiation, and administrative organization. The crown strengthened by building on the reforms associated with Alfred and his successors, fortified towns, local defense, and a more coordinated response to attack. Over time, that made it harder for outside armies to live off the land or hold broad stretches of territory for long. The reconquest of England did not mean the disappearance of Scandinavian influence. Place names, settlement patterns, and local families remained, but it did mean that the old pattern of repeated Viking expansion into England was becoming less effective. Raids could still cause damage, and later attacks would still occur, but the political conditions that had made the 9th century so unstable were changing. The English kingdoms were becoming more coherent, and a more coherent kingdom was harder to break apart. A similar development was taking place in Scandinavia itself. Earlier power had often been local and personal, tied to chieftains, households, and regional alliances. By the 11th century, rulers in Denmark and Norway were trying to turn that patchwork into something more unified. That did not happen evenly, and it met resistance, but the direction was clear. A king who could command more land could field larger forces, build stronger alliances, and intervene more effectively in the wider North Sea world. The age of small, mobile warbands did not end at once, but it was being overtaken by the politics of kingdoms. This mattered because warfare itself was changing. In the earlier Viking Age, speed and surprise had been the main advantages. A fleet could strike a monastery, a market, or a river settlement before defenders could gather. In the 11th century, those advantages still mattered, but they were no longer enough on their own. Larger armies, stronger fortifications, and better coordination made quick plunder less reliable. At the same time, Scandinavian rulers were no longer only raiders. They were negotiating with England, with the Empire, and with one another as monarchs. The same societies that had once produced raiding fleets were now producing royal courts, bishoprics, and administrative centers. That shift is visible in the careers of the late Viking Age rulers. Knut, sometimes called Knut the Great, ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway at different points, showing how far Scandinavian power had moved from local chieftaincy. His rule was not just a conquest story. It reflected a broader political change. He governed through kingship, patronage, and Christian institutions, not merely through raids. His reign shows how the Viking world was being drawn into the wider structures of medieval Europe, even as it retained its northern identity. In Norway, unification also continued, though it remained uneven and contested. Royal power expanded, but local authority did not vanish overnight. The older world of regional chiefs and independent landholders still had deep roots. Yet each generation of rulers had more reason to present itself as ruling a larger realm rather than a single locality. That tendency toward consolidation is one of the clearest signs that the Viking Age was entering its final phase. Expansion outward mattered less than control inward. The same was true in Denmark. Royal authority had already become more visible through monuments, coinage, and Christian patronage, and by the 11th century the state was becoming clearer in the historical record. Kings were no longer remembered only in saga tradition or later legend. They were tied to inscriptions, church foundations, and the practical work of rule. The Jelling monuments belong to this broader world of royal self-presentation, even though they date from an earlier stage of consolidation. By the 11th century, that logic of legitimacy was part of ordinary politics. A ruler needed more than force. He needed recognition, ritual, and institutional support. State growth across Europe put further pressure on the older Viking pattern. Kingdoms and principalities were becoming more organized. Churches, bishoprics, and written administration gave rulers additional tools. Trade was changing too. Important routes remained open, but many were now more closely supervised by stronger authorities. That made it harder for independent seaborne groups to operate as freely as before. The Scandinavian world had once profited from political fragmentation, which offered many openings. As states matured, those openings narrowed. There was still room for movement. People continued to travel, trade, serve as mercenaries, and migrate. But that movement was increasingly absorbed into established political systems. The distinction between Viking and King's man became less clear. Some Scandinavians served foreign rulers, some became nobles in foreign lands, some ruled from their own kingdoms. The age of open-ended expansion was giving way to one of integration that was especially visible in England, where Scandinavian settlement had already become part of the country's social fabric, even as English kings reasserted control. By the end of the 11th century, the old pattern of Viking expansion had narrowed. Independent warbands could still raid, and seaborne power still mattered. But the great opening centuries were over. Larger kingdoms were now setting the terms. The North Sea world was becoming less a frontier of sudden opportunity and more a space of competing states, each with fixed claims, stronger institutions, and deeper political memory. That is what made the 11th century an endgame. It did not erase the Viking Age at once, but it changed the conditions that had defined it. If the 11th century narrowed the older Viking pattern of expansion, it did not erase what had come before. The Viking Age left lasting traces in language, in maps, in political institutions, and in the way medieval Europe remembered the North. Some of those traces are easy to see, others survive in place names, family names, legal customs, and settlement patterns that outlasted the age itself. It was not only a period of raids and voyages, it was also a period of durable change. One of the clearest legacies is linguistic, where Scandinavian settlers remained. Their speech left marks on local language that survived long after political control shifted. English preserved many words that entered through contact with Old Norse, especially in areas of dense Scandinavian settlement. Everyday terms crossed from one language to another when communities lived side by side, traded, married, or shared local markets. The same process shaped personal names and place names. Across northern and eastern England, and in parts of Scotland and Ireland, Scandinavian naming patterns became part of the local landscape. Place names are especially useful because they show where people actually lived, not just where armies passed through. In England, names ending in forms associated with Scandinavian settlement are concentrated in regions that belong to the Danelaw and nearby areas. That does not mean every such name was created in the same year or by the same group. It does show how deeply settlement became rooted. In the North Atlantic, too, Icelandic and Norse place names still map the first centuries of habitation. Names like these are quiet evidence, but they are persistent. Settlement patterns themselves changed the geography of Europe. The Norse did not only raid coastlines, they founded communities, farmed new land, and tied remote regions into broader networks. In England, Scandinavian colonization altered patterns of landholding and local administration in the north and east. In the Scottish Islands and parts of Ireland, Norse settlement connected island communities to the North Sea world. In Iceland, the settlement of the island created a society that was North Atlantic in origin but local in development. In Greenland, Scandinavian communities extended that frontier further, though under harder conditions. These were not temporary camps. They became lived landscapes with farms, harbours, assemblies, and inheritance. Political development was shaped as well, though the effect was uneven. In some places, Scandinavian conquest forced rival kingdoms to adapt, centralize, and fight more effectively. In England, the struggle with Viking rulers helped drive stronger royal administration, fortified burhs, and a more organized military response. Later English kings inherited a political environment shaped in part by that pressure. In Scandinavia itself, the age of overseas movement overlapped with the slow emergence of kingship. Denmark and Norway moved toward larger royal structures, even if local power remained important for a long time. The political world that followed was not simply more peaceful, it was more bounded, more institutional, and more tied to kings who could claim wider authority. That wider authority left visible records. Runestones, royal monuments, and Christian memorials show both change and continuity. Some stones commemorate men who traveled, traded, or died abroad. Others mark conversion and the new religious order taking hold. The Jelling monuments in Denmark are among the best-known examples because they combine royal power, Christian imagery, and public statement in a single place. Similar patterns appear elsewhere in the north, where elite display shifted from older forms of status toward forms that fit Christian Europe more comfortably. The conversion of Scandinavia also changed how the Viking Age was remembered. Later medieval writers often looked back through a Christian lens, which shaped what they emphasized and what they ignored. In English, Irish, and continental sources, raiders could appear as violent outsiders, while Scandinavian kings and converts were sometimes treated as legitimate rulers once they entered Christian political life. In Iceland, later Saga literature preserved stories about settlement and conflict, but those texts were written down long after the first generations had passed. They are invaluable sources, but they are not simple eyewitness accounts. They combine memory, family tradition, law, and literary shaping. Archaeology offers a different kind of evidence. Graves, ship burials, tools, household goods, weapons, and trade items show how people lived and what they valued. These finds do not always confirm the stories later writers told, and they do not always line up neatly with royal or ecclesiastical narratives. But taken together, they show that the Viking Age was embedded in ordinary life as well as famous events. A carved comb, a loom weight, a trading weight, or a farmstead foundation can tell us as much about continuity as a raid or battle can. The age was made not only by movement, but by settlement, labor, and adaptation. Its wider memory also spread beyond the north. Medieval Europe remembered the Vikings as raiders, traders, settlers, mercenaries, and sometimes rulers. Those images varied by region and by author. In one place they were enemies from the sea. In another, they were part of a local political settlement. In still another, they were ancestors folded into a later national story. That is one reason the Viking Age has remained so visible in modern imagination. It left enough documentation and material evidence to be studied, but it also left room for later generations to interpret it in sharply different ways. So the legacy of the Viking Age is not a single outcome. It is a set of changes that survived the period itself. Languages absorbed new words. Maps kept old names, settlement created new communities, kingship hardened into larger states, Christianity redefined public life. Memory preserved some events and reshaped others. Long after the raiding bands had been absorbed into the political world around them, the marks they left remained built into the landscape and into the institutions that followed. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was no longer defined mainly by the sudden coastal raids that had first alarmed Western Europe. In many places, Scandinavian power had become territorial, administrative, and increasingly Christian. The same seafaring skill that had carried raiders across the North Sea now supported kings, merchants, settlers, and diplomats. The old pattern of small bands striking vulnerable shores did not disappear all at once, but it mattered less as kingdoms grew stronger and as Scandinavian rulers became tied to the wider structures of medieval Europe. This change can be seen most clearly in the places where Scandinavian settlers had already become rooted. In England, the Danelaw had long since turned from a frontier of conquest into a mixed society of local English and Scandinavian descent. In Ireland, the major Norse towns had become permanent urban centres with commercial and political roles of their own. In Iceland, law and household authority replaced any hope of imported kingship. In Greenland, survival depended on a fragile colonial life at the edge of the North Atlantic. In each case, the story moved from mobility towards settlement and from repeated raiding toward the slower work of farming, trade, marriage, inheritance, and local rule. At the same time, the Scandinavian homelands changed. Kingship became more established in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, though unevenly and at different speeds. Royal authority depended on alliances, taxation, military strength, and the ability to claim legitimacy in both old and new ways. Christianity helped with that process. A Christian king could present himself as part of a wider European order rather than merely the strongest man among local chieftains. Churches, bishops, and written law gave rulers new tools that did not erase older customs overnight, and conversion was often gradual and practical rather than sudden and total. But it changed how power was expressed and recorded. This is one reason the end of the Viking Age is hard to mark with a single date. There is no one clear moment when seaborne raiders simply stopped existing. Instead, the balance shifted. As English, German, and Scandinavian rulers built more stable states, the opportunities for independent Viking warfare narrowed. Coastal defenses improved. Tribute became harder to extract. Armies and fleets became larger, more organized, and more tied to governments. The world that had once rewarded flexible raiding parties now favored settled authority. Some Scandinavians entered that world as rulers, many as farmers and traders, and others as soldiers in foreign service. The activity remained, but its shape changed. Later medieval writers often treated the Vikings as a distinct northern people separated from the rest of Europe. In fact, they became part of Europe's political and cultural landscape. They took land, but they also adopted local institutions. They fought Christian kingdoms, but they also converted and served them. They moved goods, but they also moved ideas, legal practices, and technologies. The result was not a simple story of conquest or defeat. It was a long absorption into the medieval world that they had helped to reshape. The evidence for that transformation survives in several forms. Archaeology shows changing burial customs, larger settlements, churches built over older habitations, and imported goods moving through regions that once seemed distant from one another. Place names preserve Scandinavian speech in parts of Britain and Ireland. Written sources, both Scandinavian and foreign, show rulers who still remembered older heroic ideals while governing in more settled political systems. Later saga literature, written after the main Viking Age, preserved memory in shaped and sometimes literary form, which means it must be used carefully. It is valuable evidence, but not a direct transcript of the age itself. The same caution applies to modern interpretations, which have often projected later national identities back onto a period that was much more fluid. What remains, then, is the larger historical result. The Viking Age did not end because movement ceased. It ended because movement became institutionally absorbed. The seaborne expansion that had begun with raids and local ambition gradually produced towns, kingdoms, Christian communities, and new regional identities. Northern Europe was not left untouched by the age, it was reorganized by it. By the time the period closed, the people once described mainly as raiders had become settlers, rulers, subjects, and neighbors within the medieval world that followed. In the end, the Viking Age is best understood as a period that began in coastal disruption and moved outward through trade, settlement, and conquest. What started as seasonal raiding and rapid travel across sea routes gradually became something more lasting. Scandinavian communities took root in new places, local rulers adapted to new pressures, and older societies absorbed people, goods, and customs from across the North Atlantic and the Baltic. The age did not close with a single event. It ended when these movements were folded into new kingdoms, new churches, and more stable political orders. The raiders did not simply disappear. They became part of the medieval worlds they had helped reshape. That is the lasting result of the Viking Age, not only the memory of ships and battles, but a changed Europe linked more tightly by contact that began on the coast and never fully ended there.